Hello, everyone. Looks like Olivier's here. He's going to join. So we're going to be tasting this, the 168th edition of Krug's Grande Cuve. And Olivier's on, but he's not requested to join yet, I don't think. Let's see. Hey,
Hey,
how are you doing?
I'm super good, thank you.
It's nice to see you.
Let me go like this.
Perfect.
Be better, even better.
Good. So how are things you're in Reims, huh?
Yeah, I'm in Reims. Things are very good.
For me, starting the day at 9 a.m. with a glass of Grande Cuve, they're going pretty well as well. I can say it's a good Monday. So excellent. Looks like a lot of people already signed on. So today Olivier Krug and I are going to be talking about the latest edition of Grande Cuve, and Olivier, you're obviously well known in the world of wine, the world of champagne, but perhaps you could say a few words about who you are and what you do.
Very good. First of all, thank you very much for your invitation. This is my tea time. This is your breakfast. Actually, I love Krug with breakfast. I am at Krug, back at Krug actually. I am in la bibliothèque de la maison de famille, the library for the family house, which is, I think this is a space, a table where we had a tasting last time we met.
Absolutely, yeah.
We were tasting around this table. And I am almost alone in the building. I could cross a big gate, and 20 meters from me is a bottling chain. So, which is good news because not only we are producing, but we are bottling the 175th edition of Grande Cuve. So we are back to work.
That's great. That's good to hear. And so, which generation of the family are you?
I am the sixth generation of the family. In my back, for those of you who know the history of the family, you have pictures of everyone, including a picture of myself just after harvest 66, when I had my first drops of Krug on my lips. And I am the sixth generation. I grew up in that house. I grew up next door. I played in that garden. And I joined Krug 31 years ago.
Fantastic.
And here I am.
So today we're both tasting the 168th edition of Grande Cuve, which, if things had been different, we'd have been tasting a few weeks ago in Reims together. But today we're tasting remotely. People often fixate in champagne, I think, on vintage bottlings. We've talked about this before, but the heart of Krug, going back really to the inception of the maison, is non-vintage blends. Well, we won't say non-vintage because I know that you don't like the term. The family doesn't like the term, but multi-vintage blends. The identity of the house is really to do with Grande Cuve. So this for me is always the emblematic bottling. Yeah, can you tell us a bit about? I think is it in the library with you, the notebook, and where it all began?
Yes. What do you bet?
Fantastic.
Yeah, it is. My hands are clean, so I can touch it.
So this is Joseph Krug's notebook.
Yes.
And the core idea, founding idea of the maison is written in there, right?
Joseph Krug was born in Mainz, which is in Germany now. He traveled Europe when in his 20s, went to Paris, and he finally found a job in one of the biggest champagne houses, where he spent 10 years. He was extremely happy. He had a good life, a good work. He married his boss wife's sister, so he was part of the family. He was getting old because he turned 42, which for that time was quite old. But despite that, his brain was boiling. And his brain was boiling because something was frustrating him. Something for him was missing in Champagne. And you know better than anyone, William, that in Champagne, one have to wait for a good year to have a good Champagne. So basically, in a good year, you source the best grapes in those few best villages, and you bottle under vintage. It's almost like a stamp telling everyone it's coming from a good year. And it's funny because most people don't even know what the year was all about, but it's like a guarantee. And in other years, you have to deal with a quality which is more uneven. And that was not satisfying at all for Joseph Krug, for whom the essence of Champagne is pleasure. And even if we could, and you know, we could speak all night about all the geeky things that we love so much about wines and Champagne, most people do not ask about the disgorgement date, the percentage of Pinot Noir, the malolactics, etc. Champagne is about pleasure. For example, this is the end of, this is Memorial Day. Let's have a glass of champagne in memory for all the American people who died for freedom. You know, and that's, I raise my glass today for your people, by the way.
No.
And
cheers, thank you.
Gave freedom to our Europe in the old time. And so Champagne is about pleasure, and that was what Joseph had in mind. And he said, so I want to be in a position to offer the very best pleasure expression, whatever the year. I don't want to rely on a good year, because not only I won't have a good year every year, but even when I have 2 or 3 in a row, they don't give me the same. They always give me something great, exciting, beautiful, but always different. So I wish I could be in a position to gather, to invite everyone, all these qualities of Champagne in one glass, in one bottle every year. So he started to survey. He had a very good sense of observation, maybe coming from his German origin, who knows. And he had noticed that in Champagne, we go far beyond 3 types of grapes and good or bad years. And I'm not going to tell you because you are half Burgundian, so you know better than me. But great wines and great wines are not coming from the average qualities. They are coming from very, very, very specific origin. And this is also true in Champagne, despite no one was really caring about that. And what justice was that Champagne is not only about these 3 grapes, good years or bad years. Champagne is about more than 300 villages with 17,000 growers. Can you imagine it? You need less than 90 minutes to drive past the whole region of Champagne, so it's a very tiny region. And in that very tiny region, you have 17,000 people managing, sometimes a very small, but at least managing a vineyard. And these people, they even manage, within this vineyard, they manage plots. And in Champagne, there are 280,000 plots. And you know my point, if we could be in a position to vinify, as you can in Burgundy, if we could vinify individually each of these plots in Champagne, we could eventually have 280,000 different expressions of Champagne.
Absolutely.
And this is what Joseph decided to look at, because he believed that the richness of Champagne would come from the ability to find, express, keep, isolate, and finally blend the different individualities.
No, I think that complexity sometimes gets missed by consumers as well, because Champagne is just one appellation, and of course there are different villages which find their way onto the label, sometimes even different single vineyards. But compared to Burgundy, which has, I don't know, 70 or so different appellations just in the Côte d'Or alone. The fact that on the label it's relatively simple in Champagne, I think sometimes means that people don't appreciate. It's just as morcellated as Burgundy, just as many small vineyards, just as many climats. So that's interesting.
We know Joseph had a strong interest for Burgundy. We found some writings, but we are still looking for more. And we are working with 2 historians at Krug. So despite we are an old house with family members, we are still hiring people to help us understand and discover our history. And this is how we discover what Joseph had in mind when he started Krug. And if I start with the end, that usually you join a business, you work with someone who is your master. You learn from cheers someone. No?
Cheers.
And you learn from someone, but sometimes you learn the craft, but you don't know why. And we finally discovered in the archives why Krug is done that way. And so the vision of Joseph was very clear. He wanted to offer every year not only the best, but the most generous expression of champagne. And of course, you cannot rely on a specific year. You cannot rely on a recipe, because every year nature gives you something different. And what he wrote in the first line of his diary is, on ne peut obtenir un bon vin. One cannot obtain a good wine without using good elements and good wines from good origin. So the very first lines are about this individuality, this parceller expressions that Joseph wanted to find at Krug. To give you an example, everyone knows about Clos du Mesnil, but Clos du Mesnil is 1.8 hectares. This is 4.5 acres. This is a very, very tiny garden. Even within Clos du Mesnil, we have 5 sub-plots. And in Le Mesnil-sur-Roger, in the village, we have around 4 hectares. Last year for Clos and the rest of Clos du Mesnil, which all are Chardonnay from the same village, grown by Krug, harvested by Krug. I mean, in theory, the same thing. We made 19 vinifications. We had 19 different approaches for each of the individual plots, individual harvest decision, individual fine-tuning of the vinifications, and individual testing. And what is interesting with testing is that when we have all these samples, they are not tested once by someone. They are tested at least twice by the testing committee, who is based at least around 6 people. So all these wines, it's, let's say 20 instead of 19, 20 wines have been tested twice. That makes 40 samples over the winter, 6 people, almost 250 tasting notes, just to understand what the Chardonnay from Le Mesnil-sur-Roger were at Krug last year. And I'm not talking about the 230 other that we saw.
And then beyond that, of course, all of those vinifications, that's a press. And then within the press, it's 7 different barrels, right?
Yes.
So really, I mean, it's a very detail-oriented process.
So they are all vinified separately. So we are still using barrels, not because we love oak, because as you know, it's a very neutral type of vinification. It is because we can adapt to the size of the plot, because sometimes the plot doesn't fill a full press. So we are not going to add foreign grapes when we want to follow a plot. So sometimes it makes 7 barrels, 10 barrels, etc. So we have every year between 250 and 300 different lots to taste.
And so the 168th edition, how many different wines went into that blend?
So, you know, since I'm getting a bit old, I lose memory and I'm not very good at figures. So we decided to give to the Krug lovers some years ago a wonderful, I believe, help, which is on the back of your bottle, which is called the Krug ID. And I believe that most of your guests today are aware of the Krug ID. Do we have the same? No, we don't have the same. I have 012 and you have 004. But it's more or less the same lot. The Krug ID is the story of your bottle. So if you Google this number, or even better, if you download the Krug appli which, by the way, is free. So this is the only thing free at Krug.
On the notebook, so.
You can download the Krug Apply as many times as you want. And with the Krug Apply, you get the full story of your bottle. So if I use it on my own screen, I enter my Krug ID, which is 219012. And then I get the full story of this bottle. I see that this champagne, for example, is blended from 198 wines, which is a number I love. Sometimes people ask me, what are your percentages for Krug? I say, what do you mean by percentages? Yes, the grapes, the wines you use. I say, around 0.5% for each of them. This is what we have. So, and I think it's an interesting way to explain the richness of what we bring to Krug. Of course, they are not coming from the same year. In that specific edition, they come from 11 different years. The youngest one is 2012.
Right, that's the base vintage.
And the oldest one is 1996. So 198 wines from 11 different years, ranging from 2012 to 1996, is a blend of this champagne. What is interesting is that every year there is a new edition of Grande Cuve. And I know this is a concept which has not always been very clear for people on the market, because usually when there is no vintage, they are used that there is no story. But right. there is a story for Krug Grande Cuve, the story of that dream of Joseph, who wanted to offer the fullest expression of champagne every year, but also the fact that every year we have to deal with different situations. And if we only take the last two editions of Grande Cuve, one has been created after the 2011 harvest, and the other one after the 2012 harvest. 2011 was a beautiful harvest. We loved it. It was full of charm, elegance, delicatesse, but it was lacking a bit of, these big boys that go in front of muscles. Yeah. And, so it's not difficult to imagine that the job of the chef de cave then was to call back from the reserve some more mature, serene, charismatic Pinot Noir, deep and sharp Chardonnay, maybe some joyful and ding, ding, ding. I love to say the meunier is like the fanfare in the orchestra. Some funny players, in order to have everyone sitting in that orchestra. In 2012, you may remember the year, and it's a year that a lot of people know very well because it was a great vintage in Champagne. It is a vintage that most of our colleagues have already released, and you know how good it was. I remember very well the Harvest 2012 with everyone going to the press and saying, oh, this is vintage of the decade, the best vintage since 1947. I mean, at Harvest time, it's hardly possible to know. Once you bottle, you have the gut feeling. And then 10 years later when you taste the champagne. But for sure, it was obvious. It was a very, very, very charismatic vintage.
Very concentrated.
So, yes.
Low yields.
So the temptation then is to say, okay, so the job of the winemaker, the cellar master, was very easy because it was so good. And well, if you ask the cellar master at Krug, she will tell you, no, it was a nightmare. So it was a nightmare. Why? So, because all the 250 wines wanted to join the blend. They were all like, I can join. And of course, Krug Grande Cuve is not about taking all the first in class of the same year. It is about offering everything that champagne can offer. So in 2012, we called, of course, some very charismatic wines from the year, but we had to go back to the reserve, not to bring power and intensity, but to bring a kind of finesse, elegance, softness that was missing in 2012 alone.
Right.
And the best example comes from the oldest wine you have in this blend, which is 1996, and all our friends know well that 1996 was one of the sharpest vintages in recent history. So every year, the creation of Grande Cuve I think is a fascinating moment because you have to bring back to the blend what the youngest year have not offered.
Yeah, and I think it's incredibly impressive to have such a palette of materials with which to blend. I mean, this has to be one of the great strengths of Krug, and that's something that since the LVMH acquisition has actually increased in terms of the number of different reserve wines you're able to keep separate in the cellars, as I understand it.
We have at Krug, we have 150 different reserve wines. You've seen them.
Yeah.
I wish I could take my iPhone and go to the cellar with you now. But we have 150 vats, and it sounds a lot. It sounds big. It is a lot indeed. But we are talking, and you've seen them, very very small, very small lots. So some of them that we've been keeping for 10 or 15 years. Imagine this 96 here, which we blended in this 168 edition in spring 2013. So we blended this 96 16 years after the vinification, which means that the oldest wine we have here is a wine that we put aside during winter 96-97, and that we tested twice or three times every year since, until we finally decided to use it. So we have a very, very intimate relationship with the oldest reserves.
Absolutely. I mean, and apart from a few regions like Madeira and Jerez, there's not really anywhere in the world where you can think of wines that we're tasting today being the creations so vividly of the past. I mean, we're really tasting something that's,
Yes.
I mean, even the people who are behind it, this is perhaps even some of the growers who contributed fruit, maybe it's their children who are making wine today, that we'll see in 20 years from now in some cases. So
you mentioned the growers, and I think it's important because, again, wine starts in the vineyard, not in the cellar. And we sometimes I have the feeling that we talk too much about the vinification and what we do, but it all starts in the vineyard. And you know that in Champagne, beside a few exceptions, most houses have to buy their grapes, and they have built their reputation, their style, their consistency of quality through an outstanding relationship with family of growers. We don't go to a big supplier
right.
to buy grapes. We are buying most of the grapes from small families, independent in most cases.
Yeah, some of whom bottle their own wine today. I meet some of them, in fact.
Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they sell us 4,000 kilograms. Sometimes they sell us 10 times more. Some of them have been supplying Krug since the 1860s.
Right.
So 6 or 7 generations on their side. And we have this very, very intimate relationship. And this relationship has some very extraordinary moments. One of them being the Vin Clair, the still wine tasting season, because we invite our growers to taste their own wines. And what is interesting at Krug is the fact that in most cases, a grower will supply a small quantity, but enough grapes to fill a press, so we can press his or her grapes, make a base wine, and we have a base wine which is made not only from the grapes of someone, but in most cases from a specific plot. So I believe we are one of the very, very few houses where a grower can taste his or her own base wines before they are blended to recreate the most generous expression of Champagne. But it's very interesting because since we started to invite them to taste the still wines 20 years ago, we've seen the quality, the precision, the beauty, of course, obviously, the sustainability approach on their side growing very, very, very fast because for the first time ever, people whose family were only growing grapes and selling the grapes know what kind of wine we can make from their grapes.
Right. No, I think that's a great initiative on your part, kind of almost like enfranchising the growers a little bit in the process.
Yes.
Yeah. So 168th edition, obviously the expression of Grande Cuve, of the vision of Joseph Krug. How do you think it compares to the last handful of releases? Because that's something that obviously now we have the edition numbers on the label. It invites comparison as well as knowing obviously it's Grande Cuve, but it invites comparison between the different editions. So I was wondering how you see 168 fitting in versus 167, 164, other recent releases in the last handful of years.
In my life, I've never heard anyone at Krug, and I will take two examples. I will take my dad or Eric Lebel, the previous chef de cave, comparing one Grande Cuve with another one. Never. And I've never done it myself, because it's not about being different. You know, when you have a vintage, you have qualities that, you know, you have champagne that fit within families of style, whether it's rich.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Grande Cuvée, the day a Grande Cuvée will taste different, I should be fired. We should all be fired. The day someone says, this is the Grande Cuvée made from that or that year, we have made a mistake. And you know, my style is very, very cash. And I know that some people in the trade, some years ago, they used a wrong selling point, which was a lazy shortcut first. And then I think it was wrong. When we released the 164th edition of Grande Cuvée, they made a shortcut using the youngest year as the base year, while I believe there is no base year as such, because it's not about base year, it's about 198 base elements for us. And it's not about which year. So we are not trying to get rid of 1 year, which I think is all about base year. And this 164th edition was the edition we created after 2008. So some people made a shortcut, like this is a 2008 based Grande Cuvée. And for me, that was awful, that was rude. And I think that was very, very sad, because it was, it meant that those people did not understand Krug. Because Krug is not about a good Krug in a good year, a less good Krug in another year. This is the opposite. And this is proven by the edition. This is actually why we decided to go open 10 years ago. You know, Krug was one of the most, you were too young, William, but Krug, but no, I'm saying that for those who don't know, it's a private joke between William and I, because he has more old Krug in his own cellar than I have myself.
Well, I'm sure that's not true. But I'm drinking it too fast is the problem.
But you know, it's almost impossible to say good years or bad years. We've done. I remember this tasting that was just before we started the Krug ID 10 years ago. We had a tasting with 5 or 6 or 7 different Grande Cuvées, and we asked people which one is the one you would love to bring back home tonight, and everyone said that one, the same. And said, are you sure? Yes. And someone said, but which one is it? Say, oh, this is the one we recreated after 2001. No one knows. But 2001 was one of the less interesting vintages in champagne for the last 20, 30 years. Absolutely. And if we had sold this champagne as based on 2001, this would not have sold.
No, it would have been a disaster.
This was the evidence that it is not about a good year or bad year. Now, if I take the two most recent edition of Grande Cuvée, 167 and 168, if you test them side by side, of course there will be a difference. There will be a difference, because at least one of the two is 1 year older than the other one. It has probably also been disgorged 1 year before, and they have not been built in the same way. So we are trying to play, I love, you know, I love my music analogies. We are trying to play a music which has been written by Joseph Krug, but we have no partition. So every year we have to listen to what we have and decide who we will be sitting in that orchestra to ideally play the same music. And if you taste the two, if you are super geeky, probably not blind, but if I was telling you this one is this one, you might say, okay, I see that the entry point of the 167th edition is not the same as the 168th edition.
Exactly.
What is interesting is if you test blind this 168th edition, most people would say that it tastes younger, fresher, more precise than the 167th. If you were telling people this is based on 2012, which was rich, people would mention the richness. And I think, again, the fascinating character of Grande Cuve is the fact that it offers everything. And this is why foodies love it so much, because of the versatility of the champagne.
No, and I would say, I mean, from my background tasting a lot of champagne, 168, if we think about 2012 as a vintage, it's a vintage that, in my mind, is a very muscular vintage, a very concentrated vintage, often slightly grilled aromatics. You could tell real skin maturity in that vintage, real ripeness and concentration. And yet 168 is extremely elegant. If anything, I find it young, a little more open than its predecessor, which is almost the opposite of what you'd expect if it were dominated by the vintage personality. So, I mean, bravo in that respect. It's and it has this wonderful patina. You know, some of the 2012s, if the vintage has a defect, it's rather, you know, the French would say carré, blocky, so broad-shouldered and muscular that it never opens up so far. I mean, we have to wait a long time for some of the best vintage 2012s, I think. But this already has this wonderful patina, has the alliance of youthful qualities with more mature qualities that make it already very delicious, I have to say. I mean, this is, I think, the second bottle I've drank.
Thank you. I will tell you later.
Yeah, so.
You know, I mean, this bottle covers more than 20 years of champagne.
Right.
And you think about the reserve, it is older than most of the vintages you find on the market. And for those of you who are extremely geeky online, the Krug ID tells you when it receives a cork. And it receives a cork early 2019. So when we release a champagne at Krug, not only it has a long aging, but it is always released after at least 12 months of disgorgement to make sure you have this serenity and everything is well melted together.
Right, and I think the average in champagne must be more like 3 months, huh? Which I think is often a pity, actually. I mean, that time on the cork really seems to be important in wine having a plenitude of expression when it reaches
we have I've seen a question, why, if I may, why some Grande Cuve mention the edition and some Grande Cuve only say Grande Cuve. It's because we only started to publish the edition, to print the edition on the label 5 years ago with the 163rd edition. So the Grande Cuve with no edition on the label are Grande Cuve which have been released before the 163rd edition.
Right, and if anybody wants to go deeper into that, going back in history, I just published last month a very extensive article going back to when it was private cuvée before it was Grande Cuve. The same concept, of course, and was the different labels and things. So there's more information on the Wine Advocate website about that.
So I think edition is in my personal mind, edition is not like a vintage approach. You know, it's not about I am more 165 versus 168. It's not about that. I think edition is a way to understand what Joseph had in mind. This idea that I'm not going to wait for a good year to make a good champagne, and I don't want to have differences between my champagnes. So I'm going to create every year the best of what I have, and I'm going to do it edition after edition because every year I have to start from scratch.
Yeah, no, I mean, it must have made it much easier for you to communicate about the real concept behind Grande Cuve as well with the editions. I mean, being able to be more explicit about what's in the bottle and equally to be more explicit about the rationale behind it, rather than just saying they're always the same. You know,
and you know
the expression of the same vision.
Yes, exactly. And we talked about it several times, and with French sommelier. We know that you know how much we love our French sommelier, but sometimes they were a bit frustrated because they said, you know, every time I sell Krug, I explain how it is made, and people are a bit scared. And you know, I'm sure that Joseph would have replied as I do. It is not about selling the technicity. I am not selling a number of wine, a formula, etc. We are offering a great champagne. And what we believe is the greatest expression of champagne in our style. So edition, I think, is a good way to introduce Krug the right way and say, what is Krug? Oh, this is the 168th time in a row that Krug has made a prestige cuvée. You mean every year? Yes, but I'm not a specialist, but don't you need a good year to make a great champagne? Yes, but Krug. Why? Because the dream of the man who's, you know, and you bring that story. And I can see 100 of smiles in front of us because this dream of the man became my little motto for the last few years. Some people call me hashtag dream of the man. So.
And so what, I mean, there may be some people who are watching who've not had Krug at all, perhaps, and you talk about the style of the Maison. How would you characterize that? I have my own ways of talking about it myself, but what would you describe the house style as being?
This one?
Or in general, the Krug patina, the Krug aesthetic.
I think there is not a house style, there is a house offer. When Joseph started, and this is the second part of the first page of his diary, he said, une bonne maison, a good house should aim for 2 champagne of the same quality. So it was clear that he wanted to, he refused this hierarchy, vintage, non-vintage. He said, I want to have champagne number 1 and champagne number 2. This is clearly written here. Champagne number 1 is Grande Cuve, because this is the only champagne that can offer every year the fullest expression of champagne. And in a way, he created a type of champagne that did not exist. And then he said, champagne number 2, depending on the circumstances of the year. And that was the vintage. And he said, we will make a vintage when we have a story worth being shared, as good as number 1. Can you believe this guy in 1842, he writes, if I make a vintage, I make it as good as the one that doesn't have a vintage on the label. And this has to be understood to understand Krug. Because Joseph had created an offer that was completely different. And while Grande Cuve is, I think Grande Cuve is a source of debate, which is endless. I mean, you pour Grande Cuve to 10 people, you ask for the top 3 words, and you will have 30 different words. You put, you serve a Krug vintage to 10 people, maybe you will have less different words. Because each vintage is a story of 1 year. And it is, in a way, it is easy to talk about a vintage. And what makes the Krug vintages interesting and sometimes fun, in a way, is the fact that they are completely different, one from each other. It's all about the year. And you know, because you know Julie Caville, our cellar master, very well, but when we test, basically we have 2 rounds of testing. We first test still wines of the year, no more than 15 wines a day, I mean, because it takes time, and we just to have an idea, a feeling of the year, and then so that testing will happen in October, November, and then in February we test again those 250 wines, 6-8 weeks after racking, and usually they have developed more personality. And this is a time when Julie, in her black book, the book into which she takes her note, will allocate, in theory, the wines to this or that cuvée. So she might say this goes to Grande Cuve. This one would be great for Grande Cuve, but I already have it. So I'm going to have it to keep it as a reserve because I would be delighted to find this type of wine next year because it's rare. This wine is so typical of what we love that year that if I make a vintage, I will use it. And you know, and you have a list of wines that qualify for vintage. And again, I used this expression before, but it's not about first in class. It is not about the best wines of the year. It is about the wines that will taste the stories the best. 2 hours ago, I was doing, forgive me, a bring your own Krug with Krug lovers from Hong Kong. And I know some of them are online now. And one of them brought a magnum of Krug 81, Krug Collection 81.
Oh, that's a nice one. Wine of the vintage.
And said, oh, that must be a great year. And I said, no and yes. I said, yes, because this is a great bottle, but in Champagne, that was not such a great year.
No, a very challenging year.
Very challenging year, but there's something that we loved in 81 at Krug, which was the supply of Chardonnay. And this was a time in history when we had, for many reasons that you know, a lot of Chardonnay available, more than Pinot Noir. So, and we love this Chardonnay. And at the end of the blending session, once my dad, Henri, had recreated the I don't know which edition it was, but the edition of that time, he looked at the wine and said, I have some wines left. I love this 81. And he blended something which he served to the team and my grandfather, who all said, oh, this is great. And someone looked at the book and said, but isn't it a Chardonnay vintage? And my dad said, I don't care, it's an 81. And to make that long story short, 81 was the first vintage with more Chardonnay than Pinot Noir. And you know that Krug is usually more a Pinot Noir type of house, but we use Chardonnay because Chardonnay was telling the story of 81 better than the Pinot Noir. And so vintage is very much about the story of the year. And it took 140 years to have a third Krug, which also is in my back, and then it's finished. I will be passing all of them, which is Krug Rosé. Krug Rosé was a dream of my dad, and his idea was to have a rosé that could be the Krug or the equivalent of Grande Cuve to the offer of rosé. So playing or enhancing the qualities of Pinot Noir, precision, finesse, fruit, a kind of crunchiness, rather than the full body type of Pinot Noir that some might be using to make their rosé. And he came with this extremely delicate, precise, refined, extravagant in a way rosé. This is the only 24th edition of Grande Cuve, and if you calculate, and I know you calculate fast, it means that we haven't made it every year since the early days, because we are a small house, and it's very challenging for a small house like us to dedicate too many plots to make the red wines that we will be using. So in the early days, we had to skip some of the blends, and so this is Krug Rosé. And besides this champagne, my dad and my uncle took the risk to release Krug Clos du Mesnil, which for that time, was a revolution. It was a shock. I remember dear old Michael Broadbent, who wrote, he was not very sure, and he said, it's a matter of taste, the most elegant way. And you imagine Krug is one of the benchmark among the great houses, a benchmark of what blending is. Blending 3 grapes from different plots, different regions, different years, and suddenly we were putting to the market a champagne made from 1 grape, 1 year, 1 plot. The easiest champagne to make in a way. But this was easy to explain and justify because my dad explained then, I'm the only one to vinify separately each of the plot. We purchased this Clos du Mesnil plot in 71. After 8 years, I noticed almost every year that there was a purity that I was not finding elsewhere. I decided to make this experiment. I think this experiment is now worth being shared with Krug lovers, and here we are.
And so I guess one more question for me, and then we might see if anyone's asking any questions who's watching. I think there have been a few. But another aspect, I mean, we have the sort of hierarchy of prestige typically in champagne between vintage and non-vintage, which we've already challenged in this discussion. But there's also the assumption, I think, in many people's minds that non-vintage wines without a vintage declaration are not as age-worthy. And that's something that I think my article, going back to the 40s and 50s, demonstrates that Grande Cuve and Private Cuve age absolutely fantastically. Some of the most long-lived wines in Champagne. But perhaps some words from you on that subject would be interesting. Do you find that that's another one of the sort of assumptions that you're having to challenge when you're trying to explain the essence of Grande Cuve to people, to wine lovers?
I think not anymore. I think the champagne market, champagne lovers in general, are now aware of the aging potential of the great champagnes. I remember in my early days, 30 years ago, no one believed it. Krug was the only house to have a label called Krug Collection with older or really older champagnes. And most people did not believe into that. And we had, my dad and my uncle had the idea to create this Krug Collection label because they had a lot of demand, especially from England, where people were used, even when they were, almost when they were born, they were used to put aside some bottles of Krug from their birth year. So the aging potential of Krug was very, very well known among champagne lovers. I believe that Krug was most probably the first champagne which was 40, 60, 70 years ago bought to be aged by people. Probably the only one. And therefore, less and less now, and we have to be very careful with some fake bottles floating on the market. But I remember 20 years ago, it was still easy to find a bottle of 47, sometimes a bottle of 28, and they were all delicious. I've not heard someone telling me that a Krug vintage went down. A bottle might go down because of storage, and this is life.
Right,
no
champagne can be fragile.
And you know, we are talking about this Memorial Day today, and this is for me a nice connection because we have 4 bottles left. We had 4 bottles left at Krug of 1915. And in 1915, this city was completely under the bombs. And my great-grandmother made a vintage in 1915. She sold everything after the war because she needed money. We kept 4 bottles. And 5 years ago, we decided to sell one of these bottles at an auction to contribute to the local children's hospital, which had been offered by your people in America. And this is called the American Memorial Hospital. And I'm talking about that today because Krug has been very much involved in this hospital. And these bottles that we sold for $116,000 in New York, we gave ourselves all the money to contribute to this hospital, which is not only saving the lives of the children, but which is also a memorial for the American kid. So this is my sentence for today.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you. And shall we see if we have a few questions? I think there was one. Do you store reserve wines in stainless vats or oak? So that's quite a technical question.
For the reserve?
I think, yeah.
Yes, I think it's a very good question. Krug is not about oak. I really, and you know, because I can make a 4-hour presentation without even talking about oak. Krug is not about oak. 50 years ago, everyone was using oak. And when Joseph started, everyone was using oak.
There was only vessel available.
So it is not about oak. Oak is the equivalent. Julie would say the little casserole. It allows us to have this micro vinification and keeps the individual character. Krug is about precision, intensity, freshness, and I will give you an example. This is the answer to your question. My grandfather, Paul, in the late 50s, early 60s, was one of the very first one in Champagne to invest massively, in the Krug scale, but to invest massively in stainless steel vats to keep the reserve wines. They used to be kept in mostly in magnums, in which they were aging quicker, plus the oak influence of the cork influence, etc. And my grandfather was obsessed by the idea to consolidate the broad scope of reserve wine at Krug. And as I said at the beginning, the reserve wines at Krug are not supposed to bring something old. This is not the aim. They are supposed to bring something that the youngest year have not offered. So the fresher we keep the wine, the better it is, because it will keep their genuine character. So we keep all our reserve wine in small stainless steel vats. Most of them, by the way, being for the geeks, being 20 or 40 hectoliters, which is very tiny.
Right. And let's see what other questions. Let's see. Some people ask what the maximum number of vintages in each Grande Cuve. I don't think there's a maximum.
I think this is the max so far. 190.
It is.
Not vintages, but 198 different wines is the biggest number.
And it must be one of the biggest spreads between the youngest wine and the oldest wine as well.
Yes. Yeah,
among them. I mean, I think the last one was back to 1990. The 167 went back to 1990. But it's okay. Well, I think let's see if there are any other questions. Those are probably the most salient ones. Okay. I'm going to finish my breakfast with the remains of the bottle. Cool. You've got a busy day planned ahead of you, or
I think it's good that you are mentioning as a breakfast, because Krug is one of the foodies' favorite champagne. It goes very, very well with food. The versatility of Grande Cuve is extraordinary. And we love pairing Krug with different cuisine. And since I'm talking about pairing, maybe one day we could meet again and talk about another field of pairing that we are investigating with Krug, which is pairing with music. And I know
absolutely, yeah.
I have a lot of questions on this pairing with music, because people think it is coming from nowhere, but actually it is scientifically proven that music influences the taste perception. So it's not dogmatic, whether you like it or not, it works. And music, like tasting, is based on the senses. So we've, instead of inviting chef or sommelier to taste the champagne, we invited musicians. And those people, they came with no preconceived idea, because they have no clue about champagne. And based on what they felt, they offer, or they created specifically some music to pair with the champagne. So we love doing this pairing with champagne. And if you have a bottle of Krug in front of you today, you should have a sip. Close your eyes so you get rid of your senses. Listen to Krug, see how far it goes, and do the same experience, the same sip with while listening to music. And you see it goes even richer and deeper.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to explore that more thoroughly next time, I hope. Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Olivier, for taking the time today. Pleasure to see you, and I hope things start to get back to normal in Rouse after this very challenging period for everybody, I think, throughout the world. Nice. And thank you for your lovely sentiments about Memorial Day as well.
Thank you very much for your invitation. Have a great day. See you soon, and take care.
Take care. See you soon.
Thank you so much.